Hello, welcome to your favorite storytelling channel. Let's get started. Imagine a man named Thomas. He seemed to have everything that many people dream of: a successful career, lots of money, and a comfortable life. Thomas owned one of the largest real estate companies in the country, known for his ability to do business and accumulate wealth. But despite all this, he lived as if he had a dark cloud over his head. It was as if the brightness of his fortune could not illuminate the darkness he felt inside. The reason for his sadness: a great love that he lost 18 years ago. Alice, his fiancée, was the great love of his life. They planned a future together full of dreams, but fate separated them in a tragic way. Since then, Thomas has changed completely. He was no longer that young man full of life and hope. The loss of Alice turned him into a bitter person, who seemed to have locked his heart and thrown away the key. In his daily life, Thomas isolated himself from any kind of emotion. He saw the world as a cold and colorless place. Even the most beautiful things, like the blue sky or the birds singing, had no meaning for him. For Thomas, everything seemed dull. He stopped believing in joy, love, or kindness. At work, his attitude was as icy as his personal life. He treated his employees harshly, showing no empathy. Many were afraid of him because they knew that, for Thomas, numbers and results were more important than people. He was so focused on his company that he seemed like a robot, programmed only to make more money, without caring about who was around him. Despite being a wealthy and influential man, Thomas lived like a person who had lost everything. He didn't smile, he didn't allow himself to feel positive emotions, and he avoided any kind of connection with other people. It was as if he had put a barrier around himself so that he would never get hurt again. But deep down, that barrier also prevented him from being happy. Thomas was the perfect example of how suffering does not choose social class, wealth, or appearance. Despite all his fame and success, he was, in truth, a deeply lonely man, stuck in the past and unable to see a future where he could be happy again. One day, as Thomas was walking quickly towards the building where he worked, something caught his attention. Right there, on the sidewalk in front of his luxurious company, there was a young woman who was different from everything he was used to seeing in that serious and gray environment. She was like a spot of color amidst the black and white of people hurriedly wearing suits and ties. The girl, who didn't look more than 20 years old, was selling flowers. She wore a simple but clean and graceful dress that swayed slightly in the wind. In her hand, she held a basket full of red, yellow and white roses, which seemed to shine even in the shy morning light. Her smile was warm, the kind that lights up the entire face, and she seemed completely oblivious to the rush and coldness of the people around her. However, Thomas saw nothing charming about that scene. In fact, he felt irritated. "Who does this girl think she is?" he muttered mentally. "Why would someone be selling flowers here, in the middle of buildings and offices?" To him, that image made no sense. It was like seeing a flower trying to grow in concrete. He looked away, pretended she didn't exist, and continued on his way. But even as he rode the elevator to his office, Thomas couldn't get the scene out of his head. Something about that young woman bothered him deeply. Maybe it was the joy she showed, even as she offered her flowers to people who barely looked at her. Or maybe it was the contrast between the softness of the flowers and the harshness of his own life. Either way, he decided to ignore it and go on with his day, as he always did, focused on work and the bitterness he carried in his heart. Little did he know that this simple encounter would be the beginning of something that would change his life forever. In the days that followed, Thomas kept seeing that young woman in front of his building. There she was, every morning, with the same basket of flowers and that smile that never seemed to fade. To him, it was irritating. After all, how could someone smile so much while facing such a troubled day? He didn't understand it, and to tell the truth, he didn't even want to. On a particularly cloudy morning, Thomas decided he'd had enough. He walked up to the young woman, his brow furrowed in his usual cold gaze. "Good morning, sir. Would you like to buy a rose? It could be for someone special or to brighten up your day," she said, still smiling, even though she could sense Thomas's serious tone. Thomas looked at her with disdain. "Someone special?" he said, almost spitting the words. "The only person I've ever loved is buried 6 feet under. I don't need those useless flowers." The young woman was taken aback for a moment, but she didn't let it get to her. She looked at him kindly and replied, "I'm sorry for your loss, sir. But did you know that love never dies? It can live on in our hearts. A prayer for the one we love can mean more than anything material." Her words hit Thomas like a rock, but instead of touching his heart, they sparked his irritation. He shook his head impatiently and replied, "Do you think talking about love will make me buy those flowers? I don't need roses or prayers. I need you to stop getting in the way of people here in front of my building." For the first time, the young woman's smile faltered. She looked down, clearly uncomfortable, but calmly replied, "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to bother you. I'm just trying to help my father, who is sick. If I'm disturbing you, I'll find another place to sell my flowers." For a brief moment, something inside Thomas stirred. He wondered when he had become so cruel. But before he could think about it any further, the young woman bent down to pick up her basket of flowers. As she moved, something glinted around her neck, a necklace that looked all too familiar. Thomas felt his heart race, and suddenly, what had started out as a simple confrontation was about to change everything. As the young woman bent down to pick up her basket of flowers, something glinted around her neck. Thomas, already impatient, could hardly believe his eyes. There, hanging around her neck, was a necklace he knew all too well. It wasn't just any necklace, it was the necklace he had made himself, years ago, for his fiancée Alice. Every detail, every curve, everything was exactly as he remembered. There couldn't possibly be another one like it. Thomas's heart began to beat faster, but it wasn't from excitement or joy. It was from pure rage. "How did you get that? You thief!" he shouted, his voice so loud that the people around him stopped to stare. The young woman stood still, surprised and frightened by Thomas's sudden reaction. I didn't steal anything, sir," she stammered, not understanding the reason for the accusation. But Thomas didn't want to hear any explanations. Anger had taken over him. He approached her, and without thinking twice, he pulled the necklace from her neck with such force that the chain broke. The impact left a red mark on the young woman's delicate skin, and she gave a small moan of pain, but said nothing. She just stood there, still, her eyes full of tears. With the necklace in his hands, Thomas was mesmerized. It was really the same necklace. He remembered the day he had made it, with all the care and love, as a special gift for Alice. The world around him seemed to disappear as he held the necklace, lost in thought. But the silence didn't last long. People on the street began to murmur, questioning what was happening. The young woman, scared and embarrassed, began to cry silently, but Thomas didn't seem to notice. He was caught up in the confusion of his own emotions, anger, pain, and a mix of doubt. "That was my fiancée's," he said through gritted teeth, almost to himself. "How dare you wear that?" The young woman, her voice trembling, tried to answer, "Sir, I don't know where it came from. It was my mother's." But Thomas was so overcome with fury that he could hear nothing but his own indignation. What he didn't know was that this moment would only be the beginning of a truth that would change everything in his life. Thomas and Alice were the kind of couple that seemed to have come out of a fairy tale. Young, in love and full of dreams, they believed that nothing in the world could separate them. Alice, with her warm smile and natural kindness, was the light in Thomas's life. He, with his dedication and creativity, did everything to see her happy. The two were always together, as if they were made for each other. One day, Thomas decided that he wanted to do something very special for Alice, something that would show how much she meant to him. His grandfather, an experienced prospector, would often bring home gold and precious stones. Inspired by this, Thomas spent weeks learning how to work with these materials alongside his grandfather. He wanted to create something unique, something that would be just hers. With care and patience, he designed a necklace that was much more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of their love. Made of gold, with a small diamond at the tip, the necklace sparkled like Alice's eyes when she was happy. Every curve, every detail of the necklace was handcrafted by Thomas, with the help and guidance of his grandfather. To him, it was not just a piece of jewelry, it was a promise that their love would last forever. On the day he delivered the gift, he was nervous but excited. Alice opened the small box and was speechless. Her eyes filled with tears as she held the necklace in her trembling hands. "It's beautiful, Thomas. I've never seen anything so perfect," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He smiled, a little shy, but full of pride for having managed to touch her heart. That moment was etched in their memories. Alice wore the necklace so lovingly that it felt like a part of her. To them, the necklace represented the love they shared, something pure and unbreakable. Little did they know that, despite all the love and happiness they had, fate was about to test the strength of that promise in ways they could never have imagined. Alice's life began to change for the worse when she accepted a job as a maid in the house of a wealthy man named Adalberto. At first, it seemed like a good opportunity. The salary helped support her family, and she believed that she could balance work with her relationship with Thomas, the love of her life. However, Adalberto was a manipulative man full of bad intentions. Adalberto began to take an interest in Alice in a way that made her uncomfortable. He would pay her exaggerated compliments, try to get too close, and sometimes use his power to create situations where she couldn't avoid his presence. Alice, who needed the job, did everything she could to keep her distance, but with each "no," she said, Adalberto became more insistent. When Adalberto found out that Alice was engaged to Thomas, he went completely crazy. He couldn't stand the idea that she had chosen another man over him. His obsession with Alice turned into something dark and dangerous. Determined to separate her from Thomas, he began to plan something cruel. In an act of pure evil, Adalberto faked a terrible accident. He made it seem like Alice had died in a car fire. Using his influence and money, he even bribed police officers to give Thomas the false news. For Thomas, his world fell apart. He believed that his fiancée, the love of his life, was gone forever. Meanwhile, Alice was alive, but imprisoned. Adalberto kept her captive, isolated from the world, telling her that no one would ever find her. She tried to escape, but he always found a way to stop her. Alice was desperate, but she never gave up on finding a way to free herself and return to Thomas. However, time passed, and the hope of finding her great love seemed increasingly distant. This tragedy changed everything. For Thomas, who believed that Alice was dead, the pain turned him into a cold and bitter person. For Alice, the struggle to escape Adalberto's clutches was a daily battle. And so, the fate of both was marked by this cruel act of a man who did not know what love was, only possession. After the tragedy, Thomas's life was never the same. When he received the news that Alice had died in an accident, it was as if the world had collapsed. She was the great love of his life, the person with whom he dreamed of building a future. Losing Alice was like losing a part of himself. Since that day, Thomas has changed completely. Before, he was a kind man full of dreams. But now, all that was left was bitterness and sadness. He withdrew from people, built a wall around his heart, and stopped believing in love or kindness. His life became a cycle of work and loneliness. He was like a shadow of the man he used to be, living just for the sake of living, without any joy or hope. Meanwhile, Alice was not dead, but her situation was even worse than Thomas could have imagined. Adalberto, the man who had destroyed their lives, kept her prisoner, isolated from the world. Alice was strong and tried to escape whenever she could, but Adalberto was relentless, using his influence and power to keep her under control. Time passed, and to make matters worse, Alice discovered that she was pregnant. Even in the midst of so much suffering, the baby brought a spark of hope to Alice. She gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, whom she named Clara. But this happiness was short-lived. Adalberto, in his obsession, took Clara for himself and ran away, separating mother and daughter. He raised Clara as if she were his own daughter, filling her head with lies about who she really was. Alice, in turn, was completely devastated. Losing Clara was like having her heart ripped out all over again. While Thomas lived his life without knowing the truth, his daughter grew up without knowing her real parents, and Alice continued to struggle to survive. Everyone was trapped in a web of lies and suffering created by Adalberto, but fate still had plans to bring together what had been separated. After days of being tormented by the image of the young woman with the necklace, Thomas could no longer ignore what he was feeling. He needed to know who she was and, more importantly, how she had gotten the necklace he had made with so much love for Alice. Determined, he began to search for answers. He asked his secretary, employees, and even people on the street, trying to find any clue that would lead him to the girl. Finally, Thomas got an address and went to where she was now selling flowers. When he found her, the young woman was visibly uncomfortable, but Thomas begged for an explanation. Despite hesitation, she eventually revealed that her name was Clara and that the necklace had belonged to her mother, who had passed away. These words came as a shock to Thomas. He looked at Clara more closely and, for the first time, noticed familiar features. Her eyes, her smile, it was like looking at Alice. With his heart racing, Thomas asked more about her past. Clara, still suspicious, said that she had been raised by her adoptive father, Adalberto, but that she knew little about her mother. It was then that everything began to make sense. Clara was not just a stranger, she was his daughter, the daughter he never knew existed. Thomas could hardly believe it. He had to tell Clara who he was and also find Alice, if she was still alive. After days of searching, Thomas finally managed to find Alice. When their eyes met, it was as if time had stopped. They were both different, marked by years of suffering, but the love between them was still there. Between tears and hugs, Alice told the whole story of how Adalberto had kept her prisoner, how she had tried to escape and how he had separated her from Clara. Thomas was devastated to hear everything Alice had been through, but he promised that now they would be together again. Thomas knew he had to confront Adalberto. He could not let everything that man had done go unnoticed. When he finally found Adalberto, the man was unrecognizable. He was no longer the powerful and arrogant man he had been before, now he was just a sick old man, confined to a bed and dependent on care. Thomas, overcome with rage, demanded explanations. Adalberto, tired of carrying so many secrets, confessed everything. He told how he had faked the accident to keep Alice away from Thomas, how he had raised Clara as his own daughter, and how he had been consumed by his obsession. His words were cold, but his expression revealed regret. Clara, who had heard everything, was torn. On the one hand, she was furious to discover that her entire life had been built on lies. On the other, Adalberto was the man who had raised her and had always cared for her with affection. When Thomas, still furious, threatened to report him, Clara intervened. "Father," she said, looking at Thomas, "I understand your pain, but he is already paying for what he did. Look at him, he has nothing left. We don't need to destroy him any more than he has already destroyed himself." Thomas hesitated, but when he looked at Clara, he realized that she was right. Adalberto's punishment now was to live with the weight of his own mistakes. He agreed to leave him alone, but only because he knew that the love and strength of his family were greater than any revenge. After everything they had been through, Thomas and Alice realized it was time to turn the page and start over. They got married in a simple but loving ceremony. It was an emotional moment, where tears and smiles mingled. Finally, the couple that had been separated for so many years were together again, and this time, nothing would separate them. Clara, now knowing the whole truth about her origins, began a new life with them. She was still learning to call Thomas Dad, but little by little, they were building a relationship full of affection. Clara was the link that connected them to the future, a symbol that, even in the midst of pain, something beautiful could emerge. She enrolled in college, determined to do something great with her life, but she continued to live with Alice and Thomas, filling the house with laughter and lively conversation. Thomas also began to change. He realized how bitter and cold he had become because of the pain he was carrying. Now, with his family by his side, he wanted to be a better man. At work, he adopted a completely different attitude. He began to treat his employees with respect, listen to them, and appreciate their efforts. Little by little, his reputation as a cruel boss was replaced by admiration and affection. Interestingly, his company prospered even more, showing that kindness and success could go hand in hand. But Thomas didn't stop there. He decided to seek redemption for all the mistakes of his past. He visited former employees he had mistreated, apologized, and even offered help to those who needed it. It was as if he was not only clearing his conscience, but also making room for something new and good in his life. While Thomas and Alice were rebuilding their lives, Adalberto lived a completely different reality. He was in a nursing home, placed there at Clara's request. Despite all the mistakes he had made, Clara still had a kind heart. She visited Adalberto every week, bringing him flowers and talking to him, even though she knew everything he had done. Adalberto, on the other hand, was a tormented man. The ghosts of his past wouldn't leave him alone. At night, he was haunted by the faces of Alice, Thomas, and even Clara herself, reminding him of the lies and the pain he had caused. He was never able to forgive himself, and his health was getting worse every day, not only because of his age, but because of the weight of the guilt he carried. Even so, Clara remained the only light in his life. She treated him with patience and kindness, showing him that, despite everything, it was still possible to offer love. For Adalberto, each visit from Clara was like a ray of sunshine in the midst of the darkness he himself created. Thomas, Alice, and Clara learned that forgiveness and love are stronger than any suffering. Although they could never erase the past, they decided that they would not be prisoners of it. Together, they built a home full of laughter, respect, and a new beginning, proving that even the most wounded hearts can find redemption. As for Adalberto, he was left with the weight of his choices, but Clara's care showed him that love is a powerful choice, even for those who do not deserve it. The cycle of pain finally came to an end, giving way to a future where kindness and a new beginning were the true protagonists. The story of Thomas, Alice, and Clara teaches us something very important. Love, forgiveness, and the chance to start over are more powerful than any pain or suffering we may face. Despite everything they had been through, losses, lies, and so many hardships, they found a way to rebuild their lives and move forward. In the beginning, it seemed like all was lost. Thomas was consumed by bitterness, Alice had suffered for years at the hands of Adalberto, and Clara grew up without knowing the truth about her parents. But even in the midst of so much suffering, the story showed that when the truth comes out and the heart opens to love, incredible things can happen. The love between Thomas and Alice, which seemed to have been destroyed by time and pain, was reborn with even more strength. They learned that forgiveness is essential, not only for those who are forgiven, but for those who decide to leave their grudges behind. Clara, in turn, was the link that brought her parents together again, bringing joy and hope for a better future. And then there is the forgiveness that Clara offered to Adalberto, a man who made many mistakes but who, in the end, found some peace thanks to her affection. This gesture reminds us that forgiveness does not mean forgetting what happened, but rather choosing not to let hatred dominate your heart. This story teaches us that, even in the most difficult moments, there is always a chance to change, to start over, and to do things differently. The past may be painful, but the future is full of possibilities, and it is up to each of us to choose what we want to build. In the end, love won. It did not erase the pain, but it was greater than it. And that is what makes this story so special, proof that love and forgiveness can transform any life, even in the darkest circumstances. With the truth finally revealed, Thomas, Alice, and Clara began to rebuild their lives. They knew they could not erase the past, but together, they could create a future full of love, something they had all lost long ago.